Hello, and welcome to today's webinar, Embracing a Multi-Cloud Strategy in 2020, brought to you by Ziff Davis B2B and Looker. I am Karen Bannon, and I'll be the moderator for today. We have just a few quick notes before we begin. Slides will advance automatically throughout our event, and in addition, the console you're looking at is customizable. This means you can move and resize any of the widgets that you see open, as well as the windows as well. We'd like the event to be as interactive as possible, so we invite you to ask any questions during our webinar by using that question box on the left side of your screen. We'll get to as many as we can towards the end of the event. And finally, an on-demand presentation will be available after our event, and you will receive a link via email. So the average enterprise today uses more than 1,000 cloud applications, plus custom enterprise software and transactional systems. This proliferation of business-critical SaaS applications creates massive amounts of data in software silos, making it difficult for legacy BI platforms to keep up. CIOs and data teams face this challenge of multi-cloud and of developing an effective strategy to understand and manage the mix of cloud resources upon which their businesses depend. This is why today our speaker will discuss how organizations can adapt to the changing cloud world, as well as why having a strategic 2020 plan that powers growth while meeting corporate obligations around data protection, cost control, and more is crucial to your ongoing cloud strategy. And so with that, I'd like to introduce our expert, Paul Miller. Paul is a principal analyst at Forrester. He's a member of Forrester's Infrastructure and Operations Research Team, focusing on digital manufacturing, the Internet of Things, and cloud. And towards the end of our event, we will also hear from Joel McKelvive from Looker, our webinar sponsor for today. And with that, let's get started. Paul, I'd like to turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Karen. And hello, everybody, and welcome to this webinar. My name is Paul Miller. I'm a principal analyst at Forrester, as Karen said, based in the UK. Hopefully, you can't hear a gale blowing through my headset. There does appear to be a gale blowing at the moment in the UK, but hopefully my headset will damp that out and you won't hear it quite as much as I can. I'd just like to stress what Karen said about asking questions. We really do want this to be an interactive process. We want to make sure that you get your questions answered. So as we go along, as I'm talking and as Joel's talking, please do put those questions into the console. And as Karen said, we will try to cover as many of them as we can. So what I wanted to do to begin with is really to look at what multi-cloud is. It's one of those terms we hear a depressing amount at the moment. Everyone seems to be talking about it, but they all seem to be talking about slightly different things. What I want to do is to share some of Forrester's view of what multi-cloud is, which we've not made up in isolation. We've arrived at this by looking at our data around what IT decision makers and IT users are telling us they're experiencing and what they're telling us are the problems they're trying to solve. So from that, we've been able to abstract a fairly robust view of what multi-cloud is and what it isn't. I then want to talk a bit about some of the drivers for multi-cloud. Why are people doing it? Why are we talking about this at all? And then end up with a little bit more on some of the strategic approaches that your organization should be taking to this multi-cloud thing, whatever it is. And as I said, please feel free to ask questions as we go along, and we will try to cover as many of those as we can. So first off then, what is multi-cloud? This thing that everyone seems to be talking about. And part of the challenge here, I think, is that some people talk about multi-cloud, some people talk about hybrid cloud, and there's a bit of confusion and a bit of muddying of the conversation going on because sometimes those terms are used interchangeably. When we look at it from Forrester, we do see a difference. We see a role and a value for hybrid cloud, and we see a role and a value for multi-cloud, but we do think they're different. And this next slide shows you why and how we think they're different. So hybrid cloud, the way Forrester looks at the world, is cloud computing and something else. So a hybrid cloud deployment might, for example, mean putting a workload into Amazon, or putting a workload into Azure, or putting a workload into Google, all of which, of course, are clouds. and then running part of the application or some related application in your own data center or in a co-location environment or on a server under your desk. Any of those would give you that sort of hybrid cloud view of the world. So hybrid cloud, cloud plus something else. Multi-cloud, the way Forrester looks at the world, is using more than one cloud. So it's running an application or a set of workloads where part of it may run in Amazon, part of it may run in Microsoft Azure, part of it may run in Google, part of it may run in Alibaba, part of it may run in some other cloud. But the point is they're all clouds, they're all public clouds, and you're running that workload or parts of that workload across those different clouds. So that's multi-cloud. The clue is in the name, multiple clouds. And then there's this third category of stuff, which is sort of hybrid cloud or indeed multi-cloud management. And that's different again. That's the applications and the tools and the processes that your organization may bring to bear to try and manage this sprawl of stuff, whether it's sprawling across more than one cloud or whether it's sprawling across a hybrid cloud environment. But either way, you need something that's going to enforce policies. You need something that's going to tell you where different parts of an application are. You need something that's going to tell you what the security controls are in all these different places you may have chosen to drop really valuable intellectual property or really sensitive customer data. You need something keeping an eye on what's going on there. And that's the hybrid cloud management piece, which is sort of a separate thing sitting off to one side. So that's the way Forrester looks at the world. And we think this makes sense. It seems to resonate with our clients when we report it back to them. And it does allow us to carve up this rather confusing mass of stuff and begin talking more sensibly and more strategically about each of these three different ways of looking at the world. So that's the analyst view. Just for some light relief, I thought I'd share Dilbert's view on the same thing. And actually, Scott Adams, the illustrator here, once again has kind of cracked what's going on here. A technology you don't understand combined with another one you probably don't understand. And the sort of the way we use these terms is probably adding to that confusion. So what we're trying to do here is to bring a little bit of clarity to what's going on. So why is multi-cloud a thing? Why are we talking about it at all? Why are those of you on the call not just putting everything into Amazon or putting everything into Azure or putting everything into Google? Why are you trying to spread workloads across these different clouds? You're making life harder for yourself. So why are you doing that? And there are some good reasons. And as we look across this space, we see broadly sort of four buckets of use case. And I'm going to look at each of those in turn here. And the first one is reasonably straightforward. And this is where you have multiple clouds, each hosting different applications based on the specific characteristics of that application. So you might, for example, put one workload in Google Compute Cloud because you like a particular aspect of Google's machine learning libraries, say. You might put a completely different application in Microsoft Azure because you like the integration with Microsoft Office, for example. You might put a third completely different application into Amazon because you like some of their IoT stuff, or you like the fact that they have a data center in a specific country where you want that application to sit. So you're looking at each application separately, and you're approaching the needs and the requirements of each application on a case-by-case basis. And that's perfectly okay. It's also, as the diagram here says, it's also very common. The likes of Coca-Cola, the likes of British Petroleum, the likes of Toyota, the likes of MasterCard, the likes, I'm sure, of almost every one of you on this call approaching multi-cloud this way. Each application going to the cloud that's best for it and not necessarily taking that step back to work out what's best for the organization as a whole. And we'll come back to that a bit in a moment. The second type of use case, also quite common, where you begin to use different clouds for different parts of an application. And again, you're doing this to optimize the requirements of each different part of an application. So it may be, for example, a retail site where the front end, the shop window of that retail website, you want that as close to the customers as possible. It's going to take very large amounts of traffic as customers are browsing through that website, looking to find the latest bargain, looking to find the latest cool technology, looking to find the latest fashion, whatever it may be. You want that to be fast, responsive, and close to the customer. The back end of that application, though, where where the billing happens and where the credit card payments are taken and where the orders are actually logged, that doesn't need to be quite as close to the customer. You may pull that back and run that closer to you or closer to your bank or in a different set of infrastructure which is more resilient or more secure because it's handling sensitive information. It's a different set of requirements for the back end as opposed to that shop window out at the front. So again, there you may be choosing different clouds and different pieces of infrastructure for those different parts of the application. The third model is where we see one cloud with multiple deployment options, perhaps a single common API. And here, this is going to be more of a sort of hybrid model because often one of those clouds will actually be in your own data center. Or, in the example here of Carnival Cruise Lines, it'll be on a ship. And that ship has limited connectivity to the cloud. So part of the application may sit out in the public cloud and run quite happily there. Other pieces of the application which need to be close to passengers on the ship and need to be regularly updated while that ship is at sea, some of that computation may sit in a data center on the ship itself. And some of the open source cloud environments, things like OpenStack, for example, lend themselves quite well to this approach, where you may have a public cloud powered by OpenStack, and then you may have a private cloud deployment also powered by OpenStack sitting on the ship itself. We see some of the public cloud providers also starting to do the same sort of thing. So for example, Azure from Microsoft, you have Azure itself running in the public cloud, and then Azure Stack, which can run in your own data center. Amazon just last week announced their own offering in this space, Outposts. So again, you can have Amazon Web Services running in the public cloud, and then Outposts perhaps running in your own data center. And common APIs, common ways of developing an application, but different sets of requirements. So if things like latency matter, you may run it in your own data center. If things like massive scale matter, you may run it in the public cloud. And you're able to make these choices and flex accordingly in this model where you have a common set of APIs. It makes it easier for developers to work across these different environments. And we're seeing, it says here, is it common? No. No, it isn't. But all of the major cloud providers are increasingly coming forward with solutions in this space. So it's certainly something they hear their clients and customers asking about. They're not necessarily deploying it in very large volumes yet. That may change. For examples like the cruise line, but also for examples like manufacturing, where, for example, you want very low latency analyzing information coming off a production line. You don't want to wait for that data to go to the cloud and come back before you make a decision. And then the fourth use case is where multiple clouds are used simultaneously for a single application. So where, for example, you as an application developer decide that you're going to offer the application you have built, and I'm sure we'll hear more about this from Luca in a moment, where you have chosen to offer the application you have built on a number of public clouds because your customers want it or require it. And so, some of the examples in here, GE Predix, they used to do that. They don't do it quite so much anymore. SAP with their cloud platform, Siemens with their MindSphere IoT platform. They offer that on both Amazon and Azure. And they do that because they say their customers require it and demand it. So Siemens therefore takes on the effort and the development effort and the development cost of ensuring that their application works equally well on both those clouds. So for the customer coming and saying, I prefer Amazon, Siemens or Luca is able to say, okay, then here you are, here's the Amazon version. The next customer comes along and prefers Azure, and they're able to be given that solution. Third customer comes along and prefers Google, maybe you meet that requirement as well. That puts a cost on the company running the application. It puts a cost on Luca or on Siemens to ensure that they keep their application up to date and optimized to use all the best features of those different clouds. But for you as a customer, that's great because it means you get whatever you want on whichever cloud you want it. So there's a challenge there. But broadly, these are the four main different use cases we see for multi-cloud as we look across the space. The next thing I want to look at, and before I do it, I'll just remind you, if you have questions, please do stick them in the chat window. The next thing I want to look at is the prevalence of multi-cloud. We all talk about it, but actually how much are we doing it? And to what extent are we doing it? And for this, I want to look at some of Forrester's survey data, where we go out to decision makers across different industries and ask them very large numbers of questions about very large numbers of things. One of those things we ask them about is multi-cloud. And so in 2018, we asked them, how many different public clouds do you use? And almost 1,800 people around the world answered that specific question. Infrastructure technology decision makers who are using or actively planning to use public cloud. We asked them, how many do you use? And these are the answers they gave us. A third said, we use just one. So probably Amazon or Microsoft in most cases for that one. 23% say they use two. 15% say they use three. 16% say they use 5 or more public clouds across their business. Now, this is public cloud infrastructure. This is infrastructure as a service. This is virtual machines and storage and networking. This does not include software as a service. So things like Salesforce, things like Office 365, things like Looker, things like Google Apps are not included here. Now that's the instant assumption. When I show this data to clients, they instantly say, oh yes, I can easily think of 5. I've got some Amazon, I've got some Office 365, I've got some Salesforce, and very quickly they get to a very big number. Those are not included here. This is only infrastructure as a service. So I think it's kind of worrying actually that 16% of respondents are using 5 or more public clouds. Think about the complexity of managing across all of those. Think about the dilution of skills within your developer organization if you're having to retain an ability to develop and deploy applications on 5 or more clouds. Think about what you're leaving on the table in terms of your ability to get economies of scale. If you're running 5 or more clouds instead of just one, you're probably spread quite thin. So that sort of worries me a bit, the 5 or more. The rest is broadly okay. So that was 2018. We asked the same question this year in 2019. So let's take a look at what's changed. And the change, from an analyst's perspective, the change is good. I like the change I'm seeing here. So the number using one vendor has gone up. Good. The number using two vendors hasn't changed, still 23%. Okay. The number using three vendors has gone up a little bit to 19%. That's okay. What's really good here is that the number using very large numbers of public clouds has fallen. So the number using 4 vendors is down to 8%. The number using 5 or more vendors is down to 12%. And I hope and expect that in 2020's data, we will see this trend continue. The number using 1, 2, or possibly 3 will continue to rise. The number using 4 or 5 will continue to fall. I hope that happens, and I'll explain why in a moment. So, how should you approach multi-cloud? As you're looking at this space, what should you do? And how do you respond, and how do you reflect the data we've just been looking at? And broadly, the headline story here is relatively clear and relatively simple. And it's all about shifting from accidental multi-cloud to strategic multi-cloud. And that gets at the numbers we were just looking at. I can explain both those pie charts by this shift from accidental to strategic. So what do I mean by that? Well, broadly, let's take a step back and think back, 5 or 6 years ago to a time when public cloud was definitely a thing. Public cloud was definitely being used in enterprise organizations, but the IT organization and the CIO often weren't interested. They had their own data centers. They had their own way of doing things, and they were okay. This sort of public cloud thing was really just for startups. It wasn't for proper business, which wasn't true then and absolutely isn't true now. But that was a message that was put out by some enterprise IT organizations. And they said, don't use this public cloud stuff. Use our data center instead. And of course, the rest of the organization did what organizations often do and completely ignored that instruction. They went around the IT organization. So the customer success organization or the sales organization went and used Salesforce. Individual development teams developing their own applications went out and got some infrastructure as a service. So one development team took its company credit card and went to Amazon. Another separate development team took its company credit card and went to Microsoft. A third team took its company credit card and went to Google, and on and on. And you can see very quickly there how we got to this multi-cloud sprawl with very large numbers of different clouds being used. And it was almost entirely accidental. No one sat down and said, let's use lots of clouds. Every individual team simply went around and picked their favorite, or picked the one they'd used before, or picked the one that had just sent them an email offering them a free trial, or whatever it may be. There were lots of reasons for this, but they all just went and picked their own. Then, of course, these applications that were being deployed inside these organizations became more and more important. They weren't just a developer playing. They weren't just a proof of concept. They suddenly started to become critical to the business. And as part of that change, the IT organization and the CIO was also increasingly looking around and saying, actually, this cloud thing isn't useless. It isn't just for startups. It actually matters to us too. And they began to develop cloud policies and cloud strategies and began to look at what the organization's response and attitude to cloud should be. And they took a couple of approaches, a couple of broad approaches. The first of those was to get very dictatorial. We have a cloud strategy now, and the cloud strategy says we will use cloud X. It might be Amazon, it might be Google, it might be Microsoft, it might be IBM, doesn't matter. We've picked one. And that's the only one our organization can now use. And they went around, and I have seen examples of this for real. They went around and started going to these developers who built applications saying, you're using the wrong cloud. We've picked X. You have to use that now. Give me your credentials for the cloud you've been using. Give me your company credit card. I'm going to cut it up. And all of this happened. And that approach to cloud doesn't work very well because it either drives those developers who cared away, or it drives their behavior underground, but it doesn't actually stop it. The better approach, and one good companies absolutely follow, is to say, we now have a cloud strategy. We recognize that all of you development teams and all of you business units have done some good work here. We recognize that you have solved problems. We recognize that you're delivering value to the business in the clouds you have chosen to use. We want to learn from that. We want to understand it. We want to onboard the best practice from that into the IT organization. But we also recognize that having 5, 7, 10 different clouds is probably not a good idea for our long-term future. So let's start bringing some of this under control. First of all, what are the pain points you as a developer feel in using your chosen cloud? To what extent can we as the IT organization take some of that pain away from you? To what extent, too, can we begin to look across the organization and start to harmonize some of these requirements? Can we get it from 7 or 8 clouds down to 5 next year? The year after, can we maybe get it down to 4 by gradually working together to move these things towards a common base? And what we often find for these sort of enlightened approaches to sort of cloud strategy, the organization may pick one as its preferred cloud. And that one may be Amazon, maybe Microsoft, maybe one of the others. It's often Amazon or Microsoft. So we have a preferred one. So if all other things are equal, if you and your application don't care, please deploy it in our preferred one, because then we can start to build up some critical mass. The IT support team can begin to build up those skills. You build a good relationship with the cloud provider. You perhaps have some competitive pressure you can bring to bear around pricing. All those sort of good common sense approaches begin to kick in. But it's only a preferred one. It's not a required one. So if you have, for example, say we've chosen Amazon as our preferred cloud for the organization. If a business unit comes and says, for this specific application, we really want to use Google because we really like the Vision APIs and its machine learning libraries, and we really need them for this application. Make that case, and that's okay. Go ahead. But it's making a case for a reason not to use the preferred one. And that's a very sensible approach in moving forward longer term. And that's why we're going to see the number of clouds in those pie charts begin to fall. We'll never get it down to just one for everybody, never. But we will get the numbers decreasing to a stage where most organizations are probably using 2 or 3. They'll have their preferred one. They'll have one they're using for odd edge cases around machine learning or AI or whatever it is. And they might have a third, which is Alibaba, for example, because they've just launched a new business in China. And so they want to use a Chinese cloud to support that. that's a very good reason for having that third cloud in the mix. So just one more sort of slide before I pass over to Joel, and then we'll get to your questions, so please do keep sticking them in. Around the challenges, I said right back at the beginning that running more than one cloud creates challenges. It makes life harder. It introduces complexity. So in our data, again, we asked people what that complexity is. What are the things that you make harder for yourself by doing this multi-cloud approach? And so here is some of the data on that. This is this year's data, hot off the press. I think the data was released a couple of weeks ago. So what challenges have you faced by using multiple cloud platforms? And this is infrastructure technology decision makers who actively have a hybrid cloud strategy, who are actively saying, we want to use more than one. And the number one concern here, entirely unsurprising, is security. And these people are not saying, this is really important, they are not saying cloud is not secure, because that's simply not true. What they are saying is that by running more than one cloud, we introduce security complexity. We have to understand the different clouds' attitudes to security. There are different ways of enforcing security policies. There are different ways of handling firewalls. All of these differences introduce complexity. So the application you build nicely and tightly and securely in one cloud may no longer be secure when you move it because the firewall works a different way. Then you get into a whole range of issues around tracking, tracking usage, tracking costs, managing compliance across these different clouds, because again, they do things differently. So that brings us back. Remember, I talked early on about hybrid cloud management platforms. This is where they come in to begin to start helping the IT organization, helping the operations teams to manage this stuff across more than one cloud. Because again, they all do it differently. And you can see down near the bottom there, 20% saying the management tools aren't actually that great. We're struggling a bit with them. We're also struggling with things like inconsistent service levels across clouds, or the ability to compare services across clouds. If I have a particular function in Amazon and I know how to use it, how do I find out whether Microsoft or Google or Alibaba has an equivalent service? How do I set about understanding that universe of possibilities? So these are the sorts of challenges that people are seeing as they try to deploy workloads across multiple clouds. None of them are insurmountable, and none of them are being selected by a huge number of respondents. So they're sort of nagging annoyances, things you need to think about, things you need to work through, rather than necessarily deal breakers. The real deal breaker, I think, is around the spread when you go to very large numbers of clouds. As I said before, spreading your developer talent too thin, spreading your operations talent too thin, spreading your budget too thin. It makes much more sense to try to bring that to as small a number of clouds as possible. That doesn't mean one. I didn't say one, a smaller number as possible. And I think that's the important message to take away here. And with that, those were sort of some of the high-level views I wanted to share. Now I'm going to pass over to Joel from Looker to talk a little bit about how they approach multi-cloud, and then we'll both be back to answer all of your questions. So please do keep sticking those into the chat window. And for now, Joel, over to you.
Thank you, Paul. I really appreciate you joining us today, and I really appreciate your discussion of intentionality around the cloud. I think that's very, very important. What we see here at Looker is that there are, as you mentioned, costs and benefits of going with a multi-cloud type of an approach. And I think that it's key to be very intentional to make sure that rather than accidentally choosing a lot of clouds or having cloud chaos throughout your organization, that you choose ones that make the right business sense with the right desired outcomes. That's really what it's all about. So I'm Joel McKelvey. I'm with Looker, and I want to talk a little bit about the workloads we typically see in the cloud here at Looker, and that is around data analytics, and building insight-driven businesses. So at Looker, where we build a data platform for analysis and business intelligence, what we're really focused on is making sure that companies have access to data, that individuals have access to data that they can use to make that business difference. And as Paul mentioned, we are multi-cloud. I'll talk a little bit about that impact. But companies that intentionally do a good job with data, and this is Forrester research, really do a better job as businesses. They're more competitive, they grow faster, they can transform their businesses in a more effective way, and they succeed during times of disruption. And so that's the workload, the types of things that people are seeing that are getting them the value that they need in the cloud. And Looker is multi-cloud from the start. We're a cloud-native company that's designed to empower people with data. And just to let you know, we work very closely with most of those larger cloud partners that Paul mentioned earlier. And we are built around this concept of being able to place your data, where you do the analysis of that data, and where you put the output of that data in a place that makes the most sense for you in the cloud. So Looker is built around an in-database architecture that leverages the power of your investment in the database. Now that database could be an on-premise database. It could be a private database that's hosted by a cloud infrastructure as a service provider. It could be a cloud-based massively parallel processing database along the lines of Redshift or Snowflake or BigQuery. But that database that you've invested in is what Looker leverages to run queries and to access the data. So when you've paid for that, hopefully flexible, hopefully modern, hopefully massively parallel processing database, Looker can leverage it wherever it happens to exist to get the most value out. And we support more than 50 SQL dialects, more than several hundred different databases that can be located essentially anywhere. So wherever your data is hosted, wherever your enterprise data warehouse is, your database is, Looker can reach out to it, communicate with it via SQL, and that gives you a lot of choice and a lot of flexibility. Now, Looker is essentially a semantic modeling layer that understands your data and presents it to people in a way that makes sense for them so that they can receive business value from it, so they can receive insights, make smarter decisions. And we ourselves can be hosted in a variety of different clouds. So the actual Looker instance can be hosted in Amazon, can be hosted in Google, and in early 2020 will be able to be hosted in Azure. So where you want to actually do that modeling and analysis can also be in the cloud that makes the most sense for you. And then we have this really great extensibility that lets people access the data either through our interface, through our API, through embedded analytics, and again, where you reach out from to get the data or where you deliver data to can be in the cloud of your choice. And so what Looker is really built on, when we say multi-cloud Looker, what we're really saying is choice. We can take data from anywhere, do the analysis of it in the cloud of your choice, and deliver it to where it has the most impact, wherever that might happen to be. And that gives you a lot of flexibility and the ability to do some of the things that Paul was talking about, such as capture value from one cloud, capture different value from a second cloud. And I think Paul specifically mentioned something like using the machine learning capabilities of one cloud, the powerful database of a second. Looker is built to accommodate that. So the choices that you're making with your multi-cloud strategy are something that Looker can support effectively. Now, Looker is a platform that sits between a huge number of data sources, which are then aggregated into data lakes and data warehouses. And what we provide is governance and modeling of that data, in-database capability I talked about before. We can help you with your security and access these things throughout the cloud, and then deliver solutions like great business intelligence, reporting, dashboarding, report delivery, where we can go a lot beyond that as well. And that is infusing workflows across your deployments with data right where it needs to be, embedding it into your portals, into applications, etc. So we can go all the way from building you really the best dashboard you'd ever see to putting charting and data directly into software products that you develop yourself. So that unified platform, this multi-cloud ready unified platform for data delivery, data processing, data modeling is what Looker is really all about. So it's important as you look at your multi-cloud strategy, particularly looking at data, to make sure whether it's Looker or another product, that you're capable of capturing the innovation in the cloud where the data is stored, where that data is processed, and where that data is delivered to. And just to close really quickly with one of our customers, Glossier, what I would say is that the whole point of multi-cloud, the whole point of data analysis is not multi-cloud because it's fun or because we have lots of new technology, or analytics because that's the most modern, most technically astute way of processing data, but it's about those business outcomes. In the case of Glossier, it's about connecting to customers where the data is coming from many clouds, from many places, processing that in a consistent way, and making it available to inferior to Glossier, to the customers themselves, so that you can have a real difference with how the business turns out. So I don't want to take too much of your time here. You can go out and read more about how Glossier is using the modern cloud and Looker to do a better job of connecting with their customers. I also have some resources here that you can access and use if you want to find out more about Looker, our multi-cloud strategy, and how we can help you with your multi-cloud strategy. And with that, I think I'm probably done here, and it's time for us to move over to questions. Is that right?
It is. Thank you so much for the presentation, for both the presentations. And it is time for our Q&A portion of the event. So just a reminder, to ask a question, go ahead and put your question right into that question box on the left side of your screen. And I've been watching. We do actually have quite a few questions that have already come in, so why don't we jump right in with the first question here. Let's see. So this question comes from Sarah, and Sarah says, what's the ideal number of clouds to use? Paul, do you want to take that one, please?
Yep, happy to. The ideal number of clouds to use is as few as possible. I think is probably the best answer. You know, as I said, looking at the pie chart, it's not about getting to one necessarily. It's about getting to as few as possible, and that's about understanding what your specific organizational requirements are, understanding what your current cloud estate looks like, how many clouds are you already using, and then understanding the extent to which you can begin to prune that down a bit. So when I talk to clients about this, 2 to 3 usually sounds about right. For some people, it will be 1. For some people, it will be 4. If you're running 7 or 8, I think you have some hard questions to ask yourself about why you're running 7 or 8. So as few as possible.
Okay, great. Thanks for that answer. So, Paul, we have another question for you here, and this one actually comes directly from Chris. Chris says, you talked about accidental multi-cloud. Is that still a thing?
Yes, Chris, it is. It's, as cloud becomes more important to organizations, and I did talk about this, we're beginning to see more of a strategic approach. So we're absolutely seeing the CIO and we're absolutely seeing the enterprise IT organization begin to play more of a role here. We're beginning to see cloud strategies and cloud policies and rules for cloud use and all the rest of it absolutely on the growth, and that is a good thing. However, there's still plenty of accidental multi-cloud. There's probably today more accidental multi-cloud than strategic multi-cloud, but the balance is shifting, and that's a good thing.
Okay, let's see. So, all right, we've got this one here. Joel, I think this is probably for you. This comes from Frank. Frank says, I'm with a healthcare firm and I want to analyze my data. Can I still stay HIPAA compliant?
Oh, well, good question. Thanks, Frank. Let me see if I can expand that question a little bit and give you a wider answer. And that is building on part of what Paul said earlier about security being one of the concerns in a multi-cloud environment. And certainly security and particularly data security and privacy are big concerns here at Looker and in the data analytics space. So I think you'll be pleasantly surprised when you start looking at security in the cloud. Most data vendors who are working in the cloud, Looker certainly offer HIPAA-compliant offerings, so you can make that work. And while there is some challenge in having a third party help you with your security, the larger cloud providers have large and sophisticated security teams that you can leverage in order to be probably more secure than you could do on your own. Now, this is a shared security partnership between you and any cloud provider that you're using. They can only supply you with tools. You can injure yourself with any tool you're given if you don't use it correctly. So you will want to make sure you're following the best practices and that you are aware and alert of what's going on. But overall, when you are in a cloud or even a multi-cloud environment with security, you have access to some really powerful, sophisticated tools and large, sometimes extraordinarily large teams that are doing security work. So you can keep yourself more secure and more compliant than you might be able to do in a private cloud. So just to be super crisp on that, yes, you can be HIPAA compliant with Looker. That's easily enough. Most of the big cloud providers and their databases have HIPAA compliant capabilities as well. And I think that it's actually the new standard to be leveraging those modern tools.
Thanks so much. You know, I wonder, Paul, do you want to sort of chime in on that one as well?
Yeah, glad to. Thank you. And you know, I think the point Joel makes about security is an important one. On a number of my slides, I showed Forrester data from these surveys we do. And one of the survey questions we ask is about the drivers for people using public cloud and the barriers to people using public cloud. I haven't looked at this in the 2019 data yet because it only came out 2 weeks ago, but certainly the 2017 and 2018 data both show what I'm about to tell you. The number one concern, the number one inhibitor to using public cloud is security, which, as I said earlier, doesn't mean people don't think the cloud is secure. It just means they need to, think about security differently. They need to move away from the idea that it's all about the boundary. Everything outside the data center is bad. Everything inside is trustworthy, which is the old model for on-premises computing. So public cloud, number one concern, security. But we also ask about drivers. And the number one driver for public cloud in 2017 and 2018 was security. And it's exactly to Joel's point. The big public cloud providers do security well. They're really, really good at it. And they invest vast amounts of money in software security and in security policies and in security procedures and in employing people with big guns and big dogs to walk around the fence outside. They're really good at this stuff. And so for organizations, thinking about where to run their applications, where to put stuff, the cloud increasingly is being seen as more secure, or at least as secure as their own data center.
Okay, great, thanks. Let's see. So we're actually coming towards the top of the hour, so why don't we just take one or two more questions, and then we'll let everyone get back to their day. And if you did ask a question that we can't get to, we'll make sure that you get an answer via email. So keep those questions coming. Let's see. So another question for Joel. This one is from Caitlin. Caitlin says, Joel, is there a capability to edit or write custom SQL?
Yes, this is a very Looker-specific question, not necessarily multi-cloud specific question. Yes, so the language that Looker speaks to your database, whether that's a cloud-based database or it's a database that's on premises, is SQL. And Looker actually writes highly performant SQL automatically as part of its querying process, but you can inject into Looker specific SQL that you would like to be received by that database. Just from a larger note for people who might not be as deep in analytics as that, SQL SQL is really, for the last 30 years almost, has been the way that we describe both querying of data and the language that databases communicate around queries. And so it's important to understand how you can access and use those databases, whether it's in the cloud or elsewhere. Every database speaks a slightly different dialect of this language, SQL. And so one of the things that Looker has invested in is making sure that when we are communicating via highly performant SQL with your database, we are speaking its specific dialect. And we announced earlier this year that we speak 50-plus dialects of SQL, and we keep adding on more as the database companies continue to innovate and add new dialects.
Okay, thank you. Let's see. One more question before we let everyone sort of give us some final thoughts. So this question comes from Steve. Steve says, is Looker cloud or premise-based?
Great question. The fundamental answer, and I think it goes back to a little bit about what Paul said, is you have a choice with Looker. It can be either, and you should really choose the one that's best for you. You should do it with intent and deliberately. Looker can be deployed as a fully hosted offering, so Looker will host our instance for you. The vast majority of our customers choose to let us host it in our cloud. The Looker cloud can actually be located in an IaaS provider of your choice. Right now we support Amazon and Google, and we'll be supporting Azure in early 2020. So if you would like us to host on your behalf, we can host in the cloud provider that makes the most sense to you. You might choose one or more of those cloud providers based on where your database is located to reduce latency and improve security and several other things that Paul spoke about. You can also host Looker yourself, either on premises or in your private cloud, out in the cloud, or your virtual private cloud in the cloud provider. So you have a lot of choices with Looker. I will say this, Looker has a very skilled security team, operations team, and we are hosting thousands of customers. And so if you had to ask them for a recommendation, I recommend you choose to have Looker hosted on your behalf. It'll save you a little bit of difficulty, and it costs the same amount, so it's probably worth doing. So again, the short answer is what makes the most sense for you. It can be hosted in the cloud or on-premise, depending on your business needs.
Okay, well, gentlemen, thank you so much for your presentations. Would either of you like to leave us with some final thoughts before we let everyone get back to their day?
Just very quickly, to use some words that Joel just used about intentional and deliberate. And I think that's the important thing here. As you approach multi-cloud, whether it's for database and analytics type workloads with Looker, or whether it's any other cloud workload you may be happening to run, intentional, deliberate, and understand what works for you and what meets your business requirements. Don't get carried away by, cloud for cloud's sake or multi-cloud for multi-cloud's sake. Solve the business problems you have. And cloud is probably part of that solution, but approach it strategically and approach it with your eyes open.
Great. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Paul. I really appreciate you sharing that with us. That's what I would have said. That's fantastic.
Well, thanks again to both of our speakers for their presentations, but I am afraid we're out of time. I'd also like to thank everyone for joining us today for our special web event, Embracing a Multi-Cloud Strategy in 2020. I am Karen Bannon, and on behalf of Paul Miller, Jill McKelvey, Looker, and everyone at the Ziff Davis B2B family of publications, thank you so much for your time and have a great day.